Good morning, everybody. Well, yeah, we're about to get started. This is a special open meeting of the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, potential amendments to community solar rule. And so today is November 6th at 9 a.m. We'll go ahead and get started with a roll call.
Chairman Aguilera,
Present?
Commissioner Nybert.
Present.
I know that Commissioner O'Connell is not present.
Yeah, Commissioner O'Connell is, we're on our fourth day of a hearing on the application to acquire the New Mexico Gas Company. And so Commissioner O'Connell is currently on that hearing. All right, so we have an agenda, and thank you to our staff for putting this together. Commissioner Nybert, do you have any changes to the agenda, or is there a motion to approve it?
I have no changes, and I'll make the motion to approve the agenda.
And I'll second. And so we'll just do a voice vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, we have 2 ayes and yes. No,
So
no nays.
yes, the agenda is approved.
Public comment is the next section. Is there anybody here wishing to provide public comment? Patrick, do we have anybody online for public comment?
Mr. Chair, we don't have anyone online for public comment.
All right, so I know that there's been a lot of work that has been going into this docket, and it's been quite a while since we started it, and really appreciate stakeholders in industry and staff coming together to try to develop common solutions for recommendations to the commission. And we have a lot of things going on, and it seems like everything is a priority. And so I really appreciate you all taking the time, and really looking forward to the presentations today from the working groups. Commissioner Nybert, do you have any opening remarks? Okay, so we're going through pretty quickly with our agenda. So Mr. Fisk is going to help me with the logistics of the next section in terms of introducing the speakers for the working group. So I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Fisk.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So now we're on to introductory presentations by the working group facilitators. And we will start with working group 1, which was concerned with the solar bill credit and subsidization issues. And we have Arthur O'Donnell, advisor to the commission. Arthur, you can go ahead. You're on. Arthur is with us via Zoom.
Thank you, Russell. Everybody can hear me. Thank you, Commissioner Aguilera, Chairman Aguilera, and Commissioner Nybert. I wanted to just give a little preface as to why we used working groups in this instance. The Commission has used stakeholder engagement in a number of proceedings and found it to be very useful in terms of sorting out issues ahead of time to try and prevent adjudication of those same issues much later in the process. So we try and work out things. In this case, the community solar group drew very interested stakeholders. We started doing working groups in the end of March and continued through the end of August. And during that time, we had more than 85 individuals participated in one or more of the working groups, and they represent a wide range of interests in this. I want to call out especially the participation of industry and utilities in working through these issues. It was a very cooperative process, recognizing that there were disagreements, and we took a lot of time to try and sort through those disagreements. Working Group 1 was configured largely to deal with some issues that had been raised during the what I call the solar bill tariffs case, that were not able to be resolved. And these included things like whether cross-subsidization of the community solar program is in the public interest, and how you go about determining what a subsidy might be, and figuring out whether there should be some compensation. Also, the recommended decision and the final decision in the tariffs case also raised but did not deal with issues regarding the use of avoided cost methodologies. In the Community Solar Act and the rule, there is one specific reference to use of avoided cost, and that is for the valuation of unsubscribed energy. That is energy that was produced by the community solar project but did not have a customer attached to it. Under the act, the commission, the energy goes into a bank that can be drawn down as more subscribers come in. But after a year, the utility would compensate the project at an avoided cost rate. In our original rule, we never determined what that avoided cost rate should be and what it should look like. So that was one of the issues. Avoided costs also came up in the sense of looking at the value of the solar bill credit and whether some component of that represents avoided costs. And so there were two main thinkings along those lines when we began. One was, as the final order in the tariffs case indicated, the commission has an interest in exploring what is avoided by the use of solar power in these instances and trying to value them. And so there was more discussion about that. And on the other hand, the utilities had in the solar tariffs case taken a position that an avoided cost methodology was the proper way to determine what the solar bill credit should be, or at least what level belongs to and should be recompensated by the customers of community solar. So those were discussions that we had. And over the course of time, some of those issues kind of went away. Generally, in terms of compensation for the utilities determined that that's really something that should go into a general rate case. And so that kind of smoothed out the process for reaching today. Today, you're going to be hearing about 4 proposals from Group 1. 2 of them are less controversial, and that is, what is the mechanism for determining the avoided cost associated with unsubscribed energy? And the second is how to deal with a component of the solar bill credit that proved to be somewhat volatile in terms of fluctuating on an every month or every 3-month basis, and that is the FPPC component of the solar bill credit. So those actually kind of reached a resolution that is non-controversial and got a lot of support. More detailed in the discussion were 2 elements, which was the subsidy issue and how you would calculate a subsidy. And so we have a proposal for that. And also an extensive look at what a valuation of solar would require in terms of trying to set up the solar bill credit. I will say that pretty early on, we had to kind of like realize that we were not going to be making any changes to the solar bill credit mechanism that was given to us by the legislature, only the way that the commission could interpret that. And so I want you to keep that framework. So we're not looking at revolutionary changes to that aspect of the program, but we are looking at refinements to it. So with that, I'll just stop and see if there are any questions about process. I want to thank especially Kevin Getko from the Office of the General Counsel, who helped me in the facilitation of Working Group 1 by taking those 2 more difficult issues and setting up a separate subgroup and meeting on a regular basis in order to kind of come up with the proposals that we had. And also thanks to Meredith Tidwell, our former Department of Energy Clean Energy Fellow, who helped with the support for all of the working groups. And we're happy to say that Anna Kelbas has joined the team in October and is continuing to help finalization of this report and kind of moving into the formal rulemaking process. So I'll pause here for any questions. And hearing none, then I'll introduce the first topic, which is proposal 1 is the valuation of renewable energy attributes. And Adam Harper from OES Solar is really the driver on this. So Adam's here, and he's going to help lead the discussion through this. What you've been given in advance is a summary of the proposal, what it entails, pros and cons for it. I'm sorry, is Adam not here yet?
Arthur, the other facilitators are going to give introductory presentations before we get to that.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then that's all I have to say about Working Group 1. And we'll move on to the facilitator for Working Group 2. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Arthur. Okay, the next speaker we have is the facilitator for Working Group 2, which worked on issues concerning project solicitation and selection. That is Alex Ryan of Incline, our program administrator. Take it away, Alex.
Thanks, Russell. Mr. Chairman, commissioners, staff, stakeholders, good morning. My name is Alex Ryan. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Incline. It's our privilege to be the program administrator of the New Mexico Community Solar Program. It's a role we've held since the summer of 2022. Incline's administration of the program cuts across a number of different aspects: project solicitation, scoring, ranking and selection, subscription management, consumer protection, creating and maintaining the program website at csnewmexico.com, and building out the program portal, which facilitates the submission of both bids and subscribers and is the central repository for program-related data. Because the selection of bids was central to Incline's administration in the early stages of the program, it was a natural fit for us to facilitate Working Group 2, focused on project solicitation, evaluation, and selection. Working Group 2 met for 5 months, from April through August of this year, every 2 weeks at first, then weekly for the majority of the time, once the scope of the material that we had to cover became evident. At its peak, nearly 45 stakeholders expressed interest in participating in this particular working group. As time went on, a highly engaged core group of about 12 stakeholders emerged, cutting across industry, trade organizations, utilities, staff, and program admin. One undercurrent of Working Group 2's discussions that I'd like to highlight is the impending loss of the federal investment tax credit. There's substantial concern in the project development community of the economic viability of projects without the ITC and the uncertainty around safe harbor provisions. This resulted in a number of stakeholders leaning towards solicitation approaches with shorter and more efficient timelines in an effort to maximize the likelihood that projects could capture the ITC before it sunsets. Even with this, because of stakeholders' differing priorities, the group never reached consensus on any single proposal. As the working group progressed, 4 different approaches ultimately emerged, each of which you'll hear about in more detail this morning. At a high level, they are as follows. 1, a solicitation based on the 2022 pilot with updates that increase transparency and streamline the project scoring and selection criteria. And this was drafted by the Coalition for Community Solar Access, or CCSA, and championed by Dylan Connolly of Affordable Solar. 2, an alternative solicitation, also based on the 2022 pilot, with added safeguards for New Mexico businesses and a dual track approach with capacity split between a competitive solicitation and a standard offer, championed by Adam Harper of OE Solar. 3, a pure standard offer that prioritizes procurement speed by removing bid scoring and ranking in favor of minimum thresholds for bid submission and a shortened procurement timeline, championed by Kevin Borgia of Sunvest. And 4, a hybrid approach that maintains project scoring through less subjective criteria and shortens timelines by awarding capacity to a bid only after it is signed an interconnection agreement, incentivizing developers to complete the interconnection process, championed again by Dylan Connolly of Affordable Solar. I'll note that many of the elements in these approaches could be carried over into one of the other approaches should the commissioners see certain elements that might form a composite solution that they believe best serves the goals of the program. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Dylan Adam, Kevin, and all the other stakeholders for the substantial time and effort that they put into Working Group 2. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Russell.
Thank you, Alex. The next presentation is by me. I was the facilitator of Working Group 3. Initially, Working Group 3 was devoted to considering rule amendments that could be applied to the first 200 megawatts of projects. In other words, the current projects, the selected projects. We considered the possibility of adopting a fast track approach for such amendments, a separate track from the rest of the rulemaking to try to get amendments in place before the project started operating. But we then rejected that idea because it wasn't really realistic to do a fast track given that our State Rules Act requires certain time periods, and we did not believe that we'd be able to get any amendments in place before projects began operating this fall. Regarding consolidated billing, which is we have two proposals today regarding consolidated billing. The proposals take into account that that operations will begin before consolidated billing could be in place. So there'll be dual billing for a period of time, and that's taken into consideration in those proposals. I note that other working groups have some proposals that could potentially be applied to the first 200 megawatts of projects. For example, some of the Working Group 4 subscriber protections or subscriber organization reporting requirements might be things that could be applied to the first 200 megawatts. Christian Casillas, who is the facilitator of that group, might elucidate that. In one of our meetings of all working groups, because we had every couple of weeks, all the working groups met together, we discussed ways in which we could differentiate in any amended rule between provisions that apply to all projects, current and future, and provisions that will apply only to future tranches. For instance, what Alex was just talking about, if a new project selection process would obviously only apply to future tranches. We did discuss the possibility of doing two separate rules, but I think by and large our consensus was that we wouldn't do that. So the proposals here would be all amendments to the current rule. We discussed in our group the considerations that we might take into account. Actually, we discussed this among all the working groups. The considerations that we might take into account in deciding whether an amendment should apply to current projects. One main consideration for that would be whether a subscriber organization with a current project may have relied upon certain expectations based upon the conditions created by the rule provisions at the time that the subscriber organization submitted its application. So that would be one consideration that we would take into account that might go against applying it to current projects. Our group eventually focused, our working group, on two types of amendments: consolidated billing and providing a more detailed process for interconnection cost sharing. In our current rule, there is a process for interconnection cost sharing, and we have received a petition for that. The commission ultimately decided that because there was an agreement between the parties, there was no order needed. But we do have a process, but this would provide the procedures that proposal would provide a more detailed process for interconnection cost sharing than we currently have in the rule. We have two consolidated billing proposals, one that is generally supported by the subscriber organizations and the subscription managers. That will be presented by Alex Passanen of Solstice. And Patrick, Alex sent me an email just now saying he didn't receive an invitation. Could you send that to him? Okay, thank you. And there's another consolidated billing proposal that is generally supported by the utilities, which will be presented by Alaric Babé of PNM. And with that, we can move on to the next. Well, I can take any questions if anyone has any. If any commissioners have any questions? I don't see any. Okay. We'll move on to Working Group 4. The facilitator was Christian Casillas. Do we have Christian on Zoom? There he is.
Good morning. Thank you, commissioners and stakeholders, for the opportunity to represent Working Group 4. My name is Christian Casillas. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition of Sustainable Communities, New Mexico, CSCNM for short. We've been an active stakeholder advocating for the prioritization and meaningful benefit of low-income households from the drafting of the Community Solar Act in 2021 through the first rulemaking process. CSCNM, along with other stakeholders, delivered a report to the PRC before the first rulemaking process on best practices for meaningful participation of low-income households. And we are currently on contract with the program administrator to deliver education and outreach with the goal of helping to increase participation of low-income households in the program. For Working Group 4, it was a stakeholder group consisting of active participation from the IOUs, developers, subscription managers, and nonprofits. The 4 proposals that I will report on later today are from the rule sections 14, 15, 16, and 17. And the 4 proposals work together to simplify and improve the communication of the program to households, especially low-income ones, simplify data reporting burdens, enhance consumer protections, and seek to further reduce barriers for low-income household participation. All 4 of these participation proposals achieved either full or near full consensus from both within the working group as well as a broader stakeholder survey of participants. And so these proposals are much less complicated and controversial than some of the other proposals worked on by working groups 1, 2, and 3. The first proposal, section 14, subscriber organization registration, clarifies when subscriber organizations must report their progress on acquiring low-income subscribers. Explicitly states that subscriber organizations will be held accountable for their specific bid commitments, highlighting program administration and commission's ability to impose penalties for unfulfilled commitments. Proposal 2 provides amendments to section 15, special subscriber provisions. These amendments work on 3 domains, expanding eligibility by adding 6 new programs to the pre-qualifying program list, simplifying enrollment by allowing households to self-attest to either their income or their participation in one of the pre-qualifying programs, as well as establishes proof that the low-income status is only required one time at enrollment, removing the burden of periodic requalification. Proposal 3 makes amendments to section 16 on subscriber protections. This proposal is about consumer protection and transparent advertising. It mandates that the uniform disclosure form given to all potential subscribers includes a clear visual example of estimated bill savings, states that the commission and program administrator can impose fines and penalties for false advertising. And then Proposal 4 amends Section 17 on subscription agreements, and it seeks to improve administrative efficiency. And I will go into more detail as well as Alex Passanen will present on a number of these as well in the afternoon. Are there any questions?
I don't see any, Christian. Thank you, Christian. We can move on to Working Group 5. John Gardner will present on Working Group 5.
Yeah, just a quick sound check, Russell. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here with everyone today. I'm sorry I couldn't make it there in person, but glad to be here virtually. My name is John Gardner. I'm a senior project manager on the DER integration team at Xcel Energy. My role at Xcel Energy is to oversee DER projects that are going through the interconnection process in Colorado, Texas, and New Mexico. Been with the company for 13 years and have really enjoyed my time on the DER team, working on interconnection studies and also working to improve customer communication and experience for our customers as they're going through the interconnection process. In addition, I also help lead the New Mexico Technical Interconnection Requirements Working Group, the TIIR working group, as mentioned in New Mexico Rule 568. And I've really enjoyed the collaboration there with some of my peers at the other IOUs and other developers and industry stakeholders. I also want to echo what Art O'Donnell had mentioned at the very beginning. You know, our working group in the TIR and even in these community solar working groups has seen positive feedback through stakeholder engagement. So I've really enjoyed that process and just want to say thank you. Before I give a quick summary of Working Group 5, I also want to mention I was a member of Working Group number 2 that was looking at the points-based RFP versus the standard offer approach. So I wanted to just briefly mention that. So to talk about Working Group 5, it was a small working group and we were able to reach, I believe, full consensus on the topic at hand. So our group was looking at attempting to codify Commissioner Nybert's concurrence by establishing some criteria when a community solar project may relocate its PCC, which is the point of common coupling or the point of interconnection. Our goal was to take the concurrence and attempt to maybe add some more clarity in how we can incorporate that into the actual community solar rule. And we really wanted to add some flexibility for projects without trying to compromise program integrity or the reliability of the system or any of the statutory policy goals. So I guess maybe why does this matter? We wanted to address some of the siting challenges that we've seen. Our Working Group 5 had another peer from PNM, and we also had developer representation from OE Solar, which was very helpful. And we wanted to talk about some of the siting challenges that maybe we've seen in past experiences. And so we wanted to address that by maybe providing some structured processes for when a relocation does occur, whenever there are certain land use or permitting issues. We also, from a utility standpoint, wanted to try to protect some of the reliability and fairness for the interconnection queue. So by discussing this in further, we wanted to maintain some of that interconnection integrity and cost neutrality that ensures that when these projects relocate, that there's no other impact materially or financially to projects that are behind in queue. And then lastly, you know, we just wanted to continue to preserve that access for these renewable energy developers while safeguarding, you know, the overall grid stability. When we see projects relocate their point of interconnection on the distribution system, there could be impacts. And so we wanted to ensure that, you know, the process for when this does occur, does this trigger a restudy? What's the communication needed between the developer and the IOU is really important. So I wanted to just give that brief overview. We'll get into some more of the details later this afternoon, but thank you for having me, Russell, and glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We can move on now to presentations and discussions of the amendment proposals. First up, we have Working Group 1, Proposal 1, which concerns the valuation of renewable energy attributes, and Adam Harper of OE Solar will be presenting on that.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Perfect. Good morning, commissioners, staff, and stakeholders. My name is Adam Harper. I'm the CEO and founder of OE Solar. I established OE Solar in 2009, so we've been operating in the state for a little over 16 years. I have been fortunate enough to be a part of this program since the inception of 62 Memorial Working Group, as well as phase one, drafting of the rules guidebook, and I have had the pleasure of being a part of phase two. As you've heard, I was fortunate enough to be a part of all of the other working groups. So I bring a unique perspective and kind of hearing what some of the other stakeholders and concerns were in those groups. And so today or this morning, I'm presenting on what's called VARA, or the value of renewable energy attributes, that is within the current bill credit. So I don't have a presentation, but what I will do is just jump in and give you a brief overview of what VARA is and what we're proposing to accomplish, as well as some of the language that we're actually proposing in the bill, and then I will be taking any questions that you may have. So for folks that don't know what VARA is, or maybe new to this, VARA is within the current statute and within the current bill credit. And what we're proposing today is to establish a methodology that will greatly and accurately evaluate those values. So today we're not determining any values, we're just trying to outline the components as well as a potential methodology. VARA's framework is loosely based on the value of solar, which was established in 2005 by Austin Energy, a municipal-owned utility. And it was for exactly what it was stated for, is to ensure that there is no cross-subsidization within that calculation, and it makes the values stand on their own 2 feet. Some of the pros and cons I'll jump into. Pros, it establishes a transparent, replicable, data-driven process to evaluate these values. It ensures a fair application of the 3% subsidy when calculated, ensuring that there's no inherent embedded subsidy within any of these components. And then third, it uses subjective, defensible third-party methodologies that were established by EPA, DOE, NREL, NPLAN, and so on. Some of the cons, it could potentially require some additional oversight from the PRC. Some methodologies may face some resistance or stakeholder negotiation, for mention like the environmental or social valuations. And then lastly, it could potentially cause additional litigation or regulatory review. I will say with all of my experience, it seems like that is, no matter what we do here, there's always that potential, but that is under the con. So I'll jump into it. This proposal is amending 17.9.573.20, which has to do with the community solar bill credit. And as you can see here, and I won't read it verbatim, but essentially this is establishing that the commission shall determine the value of the renewable energy attributes, or VARA, for the purpose of calculating the total aggregate retail rate. And so essentially what that means is that it's just a subcomponent of how we're calculating the TAR to ensure that there's no subsidy inherently built in, but also at the same time, the community solar bill credit accurately and fairly values the power or the rate in which community solar facilities are being compensated for the benefit that they are bringing to the grid and all ratepayers. And so within that, we're proposing that the value of renewable energy attributes within the calculation of TAR shall conclude at least 8 components, but also subject to additional components as the commission or future stakeholders may see. And so the first one is ancillary services. And this was something that Mr. Gardner had mentioned, that during the process of working through TIIR, as well as the rewriting of 568, had concluded that there's a requirement that all community solar facilities incorporate smart inverters. And so smart inverters are essentially there to help provide additional benefits and less stress on the distribution system, which is outside of just straight generation and capacity. So these are essentially ancillary services. And so over the period of working through this group, we had found that the current community solar bill credit does not capture this value. But as you have heard, these facilities are providing that value. So that was the first one. The second one, which is a little bit more controversial, is environmental benefits, which could be valued or tied to the social cost of carbon or some kind of emission reduction. Third is social and / job creation. Fourth, community health benefits. 5, low income collection. 6, line loss. 7, distribution and operation maintenance that is inverted. And then 8 is the RPS value that could be included. And so with that essentially sums up what we are trying to propose today, is that we establish a methodology and potential future working groups to help establish what those values could be. So then that way that we can ensure that the community solar bill credit accurately and fairly compensates subscriber organizations, as well as does not require additional subsidy or any burden from subscribers that aren't participating in the program. And with that, I will open it up for any questions.
Well, I don't have necessarily any questions on this one, just trying to figure out, are the proposals, it seems like they're alternative proposals, right?
So this is the only proposal for VARA. The other ones are for different topics like the subsidization calculation and the fuel clause. So there is no other alternative proposals for VARA.
Okay. I appreciate the presentation. I don't have any questions. Commissioner Nyberg, do you have any questions on?
I do. Says the commission shall determine the value of renewable energy attributes for the purpose of calculating the total aggregate retail rate. So we're looking at the retail rate. Is that based on 24-hour average energy? Or is that just for the times a day that solar would be producing?
So TAR is built into essentially the act and how we're calculating or how the utilities draft their tariffs. So it's on a 24-hour basis, 700 or 365 days a year. And within TAR, or the total aggregate retail rate that requires the commission and us to calculate the community solar bill credit, there's what's called the renewable energy attributes, which is what this proposal. And so that component already lives within TAR, but it's currently not being calculated. So, or it has a value of 0. And so what this does is works within the confines of the statute and what TAR is already required. And we're trying to put some subcomponents to what is a renewable energy attribute or an environmental benefit. And what I have found is that these subcomponents historically go into that framework. And so it's not necessarily a set time. It's built within how the tariff would be calculated, which drives the community solar bill credit.
It seems that some of those values can only be determined by a body that sets public policy. And I'm unsure whether the commission is such a body, but anyway, this looks like it complicates it quite a bit. I think I hope somebody on our staff can maybe sit down and go through this at some point and see whether this is things that we want to really get engaged in.
Commissioner Nybert, I can state from my experience working through these groups, it sounds like discussing this with the utilities, that this is a pretty standard practice when the utilities are even looking at avoided cost. So again, we could debate what those values could be, but there wasn't any debate in these or if these subcomponents should be evaluated when you're concluding what that value would be.
You don't believe our staff would be concerned with these complications?
I don't believe so. I think we would have maybe some difference of opinions if one should be valued at a higher value than others. But there was discussion that these are very standard components when tariffs are being drafted. But I will admit I am not a utility rate maker.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well,
Thank you, Adam. Let's move on to proposal 2 from working group 1. Adjustments to the solar bill credit for changes in the fuel clause. And we have Mike Setledge, SPS. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Brief introduction. I'm Mike Setledge. I currently work for SPS, part of Excel Energy. For most of this subgroup work and this community solar evolution, I was working for P&M, so I've got some background on both of those, but I'm with SPS right now. Proposal 2 has to do with the fuel clause, which is one of the components of the solar bill credit. There are 3 components. One of them is related to the base rates, and the base rates, remember, are based on costs that are more or less fixed for a period of time. So these are costs that are less volatile, and they're part of the base rate. They're done in the rate cases where we come up with these base rates, and they're approved by the commission. And a while back, I don't know the exact years, a little bit before my time, the fuel components were taken out of that because they were much more volatile. And so the second component of the bill credit is the fuel and purchase power cost adjustment. And that really is a little bit of a misnomer because it's fuel, but it's purchases and sales. So it's fuel and market interaction are what's in that one. And one of the reasons that was taken out is because it's so much more difficult to accurately forecast going forward. There's a lot of volatility. Weather can drive that and other things. So it's separated out. The third component of the solar bill is the renewable attributes. And they are currently pegged to the RPS standard is how that's done in the solar bill credits. There isn't much of a calculation. It uses an existing rider as a proxy for that until such time as we come up with something different than that and the commission approves that. So anyway, back to the fuel adjustment clause. There was a couple of words that were slightly different. The language in the rule left out the word purchase power cost. It was fuel and power cost. It really should be purchase. So the amendment introduces that word just for clarity. So there's exactly the same wording between this and what's in the FPPCAC wording to eliminate that confusion. There was concerns about the volatility of the fuel clause and making it difficult to predict what the total solar bill credit would be each month. And it turns out there was not a whole lot of consensus on any way to make it better. So the consensus was that we arrived at was just to fix that to make sure it's the same as the other fuel component on the bill. So when a customer receives a bill, they will see a credit rate that exactly equals the charge rate. So it makes sense. The quantities may be different, but at least the rates are the same each month. That's easier for the customers to understand, I think. Should have said a little bit more about my background. I was involved in this from near the beginning of this and working for P&M, and perspective we've always had was that this should be the community solar program should be designed and implemented as best possible to make it clear and simple for customers to understand, that they have more clarity, more transparency on these things. And I think that's what I've worked through all of these groups as best I could to help ensure that customers have a bill that's understandable and clear and is follows the rule as closely as is possible. Yeah, just some other language, basically just a little bit of language cleanup. This was not a very controversial thing. We wanted to make sure it was crystal clear that the credit rate and the charge rate would be linked together, and just clean up the language a little bit so there wasn't a discrepancy of even one word between the language in the fuel clause and the language we've got here. With that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
That seems simple enough. Thank you. I don't have questions. Commissioner Everett?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So we can move on to proposal 3 from working group 1 concerning subsidization. We have Stephanie Zur from the Renewable Energy Industries Association, REIA. Stephanie, you can take it away.
Thank you, Russell. Good morning, Commissioner Nyberg and Chairman Aguilera. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Thank you. So this proposal would add a new section 21, and it addresses subsidies. So before I get to the proposal, I want to take a step back and tell you what necessitated this addition. And if you look at the final order on phase 2 in case 2371, there were certain important decisions the commission declined to make at that time, instead wanting to get more information. And so that background is important to understanding what we're doing with this rule. So just briefly, first of all, the commission declined to make a determination that it's in the public interest for non-subscribers to subsidize subscribers. This is part of the Community Solar Act, and it requires the commission to make that determination that it's in the public interest for non-subscribers to subscribe to subsidize subscribers up to 3%. But at that time, the commission held that such a finding would require determination as to whether a subsidy is necessary to reasonably allow for the creation, financing, and accessibility of community solar facilities. And such a determination would require information about the financial viability of the projects in the program, and we don't have information about that. And so the commission directed that in the pending rulemaking proceeding, which is the one we're in now, 24285, potential amendments to the rule will provide an opportunity to build a record and make a decision regarding subsidies. And so because the commission did not make a determination about whether subsidization was in the public interest, there was a lot of concern about the potential for clawbacks and the disruptive effect that would have on the program. Here we are with a brand new program trying to inform people about what their expectations should be about bill savings, and with clawbacks hanging over, as a sort of Damocles, it threatened the viability of the program. And so because the commission kicked the can down the road on making subsidy determinations, they also decided there would be no clawbacks. So that only refers to the first 200 megawatts. And we do not have any decision about as to the next 300 megawatts of program capacity, whether there will be permitted subsidizations up to the 3% limit, and if there is a potential for clawbacks. The commission, additionally, even though it wasn't making a determination about subsidies, it required the utilities to track avoided costs so that a determination could be made that considers not just the the costs of the program, but the benefits of it. What are the avoided costs? And so they entered an accounting order to do that. So now I'm going to move to the proposal. And the first thing it does, this is the proposed new section 21. In Part A, it proposes that the commission will find it is in the public interest for non-subscribers to subsidize subscribers. Non-subscribers shall not be charged more than 3% of the non-subscribers' aggregate retail rate on the annual basis to subsidize subscribers. And with that proposal, this will invite commenters, participants to come in and explain why subsidization is required to the viability of the program. And, just sitting here right now, I could tell you how important this is, since we have determined that subsidies are not going to be allowed and that you cannot claw back any costs that exceed benefits from the first 200 megawatts. That basically only leaves the utilities as a source to recover subsidies. You can't get it from ratepayers because it's not allowed, and you can't claw it back. We're going to go in and add another 300 megawatts, and we're going to even compound this problem. And so when you look at subsidies, this proposal is going to take a full suite of long-term subsidies in the form of avoided costs and net them against the benefits. And when you do that, we've got to figure out, if it turns out there's a subsidy, how to accommodate those subsidies. And so the rest of the rule, what it does is in Part B, it explains the subsidy calculation will be based on the difference between the full long-term cost and full long-term benefits in aggregate over their useful lives. And the reason we have to look at it on a long-term basis is to make sure that we put ratepayers that are program participants and those who are not program participants on an equal footing. And we don't have community solar having to be considered to be subsidized when we're not even looking at all the benefits that are provided. We need to ensure that they're all accounted for. And so the commission's order for the utilities to track the costs was made by reference to the testimony of Justin Barnes. And so I'm going to give you a reference for that. And this was direct testimony, November 13th, 2023, in case 23-00 230071 UT. And first of all, the commission, when they decided to track costs, they basically referenced the recommended decision, but then the recommended decision referenced Mr. Barnes' testimony. And so this is going to be the guidebook. It's way too much to put into a rule. But what this order did was to set forth categories of avoided costs that should be tracked, including generation and transmission and so forth. And it also, the recommended decision, which the commission adopted, that portion that ordered costs to be tracked, actually referenced a methodology for tracking certain costs. But not all of the costs listed in the rule, the avoided costs, are ones the utilities are tracking. And so Mr. Barnes explained there's certain costs that have methodologies that are accepted, that have been used. We have guidelines and standards for doing this. Those should be tracked, and here's how you do it. But then there's other costs and benefits that, just benefits that we don't have necessarily a methodology to determine those and quantify those. And so that would be in rate cases. And so what we have is basically the cost tracking And this will all come to a head when we get to a rate case, and then we determine where we're at. So basically, subsidization is going to be determined by looking in the rearview mirror. We're not going to know how much is a subsidy or if there's a subsidy at all until we get into the rate case and we look at the costs and benefits. And it's for that reason, I think it's really important that the commission now make a determination that subsidization up to the 3% limit should be allowed, because we may be having subsidization and we may not, but we're not going to know it till we do these calculations. And if we say it's not allowed, I don't know where that leaves the utilities as far as cost recovery. And I don't know where that leaves community solar with such uncertainty as to how much subscribers stand to gain. So this is, I think, a really important and crucial component to make a successful community solar program going forward. And back to the rules. So Section C provides the different elements of costs and benefits that should be considered. And then Section D talks about how we do the calculation. And basically, we're going to net benefits against costs. The costs are going to be provided in a volumetric rate, as will the benefits and costs, and netted against each other. So, for example, if the subscriber credit rate is 10 cents a kilowatt hour, the benefits rate is 6 cents a kilowatt hour, the net utility cost is 4 cents. At a generation volume of 100 million kilowatt hours, the subsidy is $4 million. So basically, Section D tells you to net costs against benefits. And then we've also added a couple of definitions, and that is this amends 17.95737. We added a definition for net utility costs and a definition for subsidy. And that is all I have for you. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you, Ms. Zare. I do have a couple of questions. So this is one of the controversial proposals, and so I just want to be clear about is the working group here proposing that, for example, this language be included in a notice of proposed rulemaking, and then we receive and hear and consider the feedback either for or against?
I would say that this language should be included and subject to the commission's determination of whether to adopt it and include it in the rule. But this commission specifically referenced this community solar rulemaking as the place to determine whether it is in the public interest to allow non-subscribers to subsidize subscribers. And so it needs to be in here so that the commission can approve it if they agree that the evidentiary foundation exists.
Okay. And just to sort of explain how I think about NOPRs, I think I'm willing to provide a proposal and hear what the comments say about it. I generally prefer to be more inclusive because I think it's easier to then potentially take something out than add it in. And so that's why I was asking the question. Now, I do have another question as to how this would apply to specific community solar projects. It seems that the calculation, well, let me ask it more as a question instead of my inference. Is the calculation treating all projects the same, or is the can the subsidy under this proposal be different depending on the project?
I hadn't really contemplated how to write a rule that would have a project specific subsidy amount. And it seems like that would be extremely complicated to do. So basically, subsidization is not going to apply to the first 200 megawatts, but the next tranche, the 300 megawatts, what will happen is there'll be a determination of how much the subsidy amount is. And if it's within the 3%, that amount would be recovered from ratepayers, and it would be in the form of a rider. And Mr. Barnes discusses how that would take place in his testimony, how we would figure out what is the subsidy percentage. And we would apply that percentage to each element of the bill. And so, no, it would not be project specific. And then amounts above the subsidy, above 3%, would have to be charged to the community solar projects themselves. And so at a certain point, you reach a cliff to where without subsidization, it may be that projects aren't viable anymore. But in general, it's going to be a rider or adder that's going to be on all ratepayers. I should say non-subscribers, who are the ones that would be subsidizing it. And it would apply across the board to subsidize all projects. By the way, when we say subsidy, that doesn't really change the compensation. The compensation is decided in the TARR. What it's doing is the subsidy calculation is deciding who to assign those costs to. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. And then as you were responding, then I started asking myself more questions. It just kind of in terms of the how the mechanism here would work. It seems like maybe there would be a rider, and can you explain, is the subsidy going to the subscribers or to the developer?
So the subsidy is a determination, if there is one, that the costs of the program are the credits and unsubscribed energy costs. Those are the costs, and the benefits are to ratepayers in general. And so the uh, the compensation comes from the TAR, and that's already determined by the commission, and it's basically statutory. And the commission decided compensation based on its interpretation of its statutes and rules. And so the subsidy is basically ensuring that when we create a bill credit amount, if that credit amount exceeds the benefits of the program, that the utility is or basically we have to account for all of that. And so it's the credit itself. The bill credit is going to ratepayers. And I guess the subsidy, I would say, is going to ratepayers. I mean, it could, to the extent there's a payment going out and it's going to be split between the developers and ratepayers. The subsidy is subsidizing the program itself. But, we know that the money is going both to the ratepayers and the developers. So I don't know if it answers your question. Subsidization is basically just the difference between long-term costs and the benefits are going to be enjoyed by program subscribers. So mostly program subscribers are going to enjoy the subsidy, and to some extent the project developers.
Okay. And so that'll be something that I will be considering because we're talking about whether the subsidy is in the public interest. And when I consider that, I'm thinking, is this in the interest of the subscribers, which the law is intended to help, or the project developer? I'm sorry, I didn't say that properly. I'm thinking about it as the subscribers. I think that if the subsidy is going to the developer, then I'm not seeing how that is necessarily in the public interest. And we are not going to regulate the price that the developer is charging. And so if we in the back end just turn around and give this subsidy to the developer, I'm questioning how that serves the public interest. Because we don't have control over how much they're going to be charging their subscribers. And, you know, as an economist, I'm thinking that the rate that the developer is going to charge is probably going to be as much as they can get, which will be the probably equal or maybe around what the utility charges, because a customer is going to be thinking, well, do I have a better deal with the utility or with this community solar project? And some people might be willing to pay a little bit more because they believe in the community solar, but I think most people are probably just going to choose whatever the cheaper option is. And so there in effect is a cap because on what the subscriber can charge, because we're creating this sort of competitive environment. And so I think to the extent that what the utility charges does create a cap on what the subscriber can charge, we have some control over, we have some knowledge about what the developer is going to charge the subscriber. But beyond that, we have no control over it. And so my point being is that if the subsidy is really just going to the developer, then in a way that kind of amounts to a transfer of wealth from what the utility would get to what the developer is now getting. And I'm not sure that that's what the law intended. And so I would just want to, if there is some kind of subsidy, to make sure that that subsidy is benefiting the subscribers.
So, Chairman Aguilera, I think what you're saying is what led the commission to defer a decision on finding subsidizations in the public interest. So first of all, I'd point out that the public interest is also in a viable community solar program. We have 30% subscription reservation for low income customers. In the last legislative general session, the legislature just enacted an amendment to the anti-discrimination clause that allowed to get rid of the Mountain States decision that says we cannot treat low income customers differently. We cannot give them benefits. So the legislature has indicated it wants to do more to help low income customers specifically. And, I consider this to be a low income program. This is what we did before we got rid of the Mountain States and said we could just do this directly. And 30% of this is reserved for low income customers. Some projects I understand have up to 50%. And so, what I think you're going to be looking for is information that will help you to determine whether subsidies are reasonably necessary for the creation, financing, and accessibility of community solar facilities. And perhaps along with the NOPR, the commission can direct interested parties to address that question and find out. And I understand you're concerned that we don't want to just create subsidies to enrich developers. But on the other hand, if we put too much uncertainty in the program, like having the a clawback hanging over developers' heads, that might lead to uncertainty of the program. And so part of allowing subsidization allows developers to know what the costs are, what they can offer, and what the subsidies should be. So I understand what you're saying, and there is going to be a tension there between wanting subsidies and wanting them to create a viable program, but not overdo it. So we're just enriching developers. And maybe that's something that we could work out with evidence in the context of this rulemaking.
Thank you, Commissioner Nyberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you read the statute regarding the public interest determination as an all or nothing proposition, in that if we make that determination, is it automatically 3%, or can this commission decide that a lesser rate is within the public interest?
I believe you have the authority to do up to 3%. So yes, the commission can determine 2%, 3%, absolutely. But if the commission is going to do less than 3%, we should do this after we've had rate cases with the utilities and get an idea of how much subsidy we're looking at. I mean, hopefully the rate cases, and then when we actually do the netting of costs and benefits, maybe we determine there's no subsidies at all. We don't know where that's going, but the subsidies basically just allow us to have some wiggle room here, because we don't know ultimately if we need subsidization or not until we look at costs and benefits and we do the netting process. So it's just creating certainty in the program, and it doesn't enrich them any more or less to say subsidies are allowed, because it doesn't change the compensation.
Well, hopefully, if there's a subsidy and we don't allow a subsidy, hopefully there's some benefit to the ratepayers who are non-subscribers. But anyway, you made the statement that benefits are to the ratepayers in general, and I don't understand that, because as I see ratepayers in general, that's basically all the ratepayers on the system. Are you viewing ratepayers in general as a more limited group?
Am I viewing them as beneficiaries of community solar? The answer is yes. They benefit from more renewable energy, reduction in greenhouse gases. We are the developers are upgrading the distribution system, and so far we haven't had cases seeking cost recovery. That's at their expense and their cost. They are doing grid upgrades. I think Adam mentioned earlier smart inverters. So there's definitely system benefits from this, and all ratepayers benefit from those system benefits. And then low income benefits are a societal benefit that benefits all ratepayers.
But you made that statement in terms of the issue of subsidization. And I think the questioning was more to the point of which group of people benefit from the subsidy. You said ratepayers in general, and I would certainly push back on that, because I think if there's a subsidy, that means the general ratepayer who is not a subscriber is paying more for their electricity than they otherwise would had there been no community solar program. Do you agree with my observation or disagree with it?
I agree that is true, but I also would point out this is legislative policy. The legislature decided subsidization should be up to 3%. And I realize they put that in your hands. But if you say we're not going to allow subsidization because we don't think the ratepayers benefit, that's going to put a limit on how much community solar can be delivered. And so if you think community solar is a benefit and reaching low income customers with ways to lower their bills. And I would also point out we have all kinds of voluntary programs. We have something called Solar Direct that benefits large customer groups. Walmart's part of it, Kroger's part. P&M just put in an application to terminate the Sky Blue program. And basically, there's not voluntary offerings for residential and other customers that aren't in these little niche programs to get more renewable energy. Just the ability to participate in this programs is a benefit to ratepayers.
Okay. I think it's a benefit to ratepayers who are subscribers. If there's subsidization, there's a cost associated with that to the non-subscribers. Moving on, the issue for me is really we're going to have some people who fall within the economic groups that can benefit from this under the statute, the 30% requirement. But you're going to have a lot of people who fall within that same economic strata that will not be subscribers. And so the issue for me is if there's a subsidy, you're actually forcing non-subscribers who fall in that same economic group to subsidize those who are taking advantage of the community solar program and getting the subsidy. And I'm going to have to weigh that. That's something that concerns me because I guess I don't have a real strong desire to, it is our law and we have to implement the law and have the community solar program as it exists in the statute. But with respect to the subsidization issue, we're having to look at the whole group of ratepayers, not just specific groups when we make a public interest determination, because it affects everybody. And that's where I kind of have some heartburn, and I'm going to have to spend some time working through that, because there are going to be a lot of people who fit the same economic or have the same economic limitations as a group of subscribers that fall within that same group that are intended beneficiaries of the program. And so these folks are going to be paying, my words, a little bit more so that the others can receive that benefit if we make such a determination. It appears to me that from your statement that we're looking at this in the rearview mirror, it seems to me that we indeed are. And I can see that we're going to need maybe some flexibility. I don't know what that percentage is, but obviously if we say no subsidization and there becomes some, how do you put the genie back in the bottle? What do we do at that point? So I can see there's maybe a need for some flexibility there. Looking at the rearview mirror to make these determinations, but I'm not sure what the percentage should be, and I'm not sure we should automatically just jump to the statutory maximum when the language said up to 3%. So I was glad to hear your reading of the statute may give us some flexibility, and that will be another thing that I'll need to think long and hard as to what maybe the proper percentage should be in that regard. But I thank you for your work and effort on this and your attention. And Mr. O'Donnell.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. I just want to provide maybe a clarification that one, in the solar bill tariffs case, the commission did not make a determination on whether it would be in the public interest for a subsidy to exist, but it also determined that for the first 200 megawatts, there was no subsidy. And that came out of a position that was stated during the case, is that the entire or some portion of the solar bill credit really was a subsidy. The commission did not accept that at all. And so you're looking for flexibility. This provision actually gives the commission flexibility in terms of determining not just a mechanism for whether there's a subsidy, but what to do about it. And as Stephanie pointed out, yeah, the commission doesn't have to go to 3%, but that's a decision left for the general rate case when the utilities can come in and show actual costs. For Commissioner Aguilera's question, the benefit here of the subsidy does accrue to the subscribers, because that's how the money flows in the community solar program that the legislature gave us to administer, right? Is that this also puts a potential cap on any possible subsidy, such that if it exceeds whatever level the commission sets, then that goes into a rider and then is assessed back on the subscribers, right? So some portion of it may flow to all ratepayers because the legislature has given us a program that we want to see successful, and it may take this to make it successful. But anything above that level, whichever the commission sets, really would be recaptured from the community solar subscribers, which would then possibly impact how much the developers or the subscriber organizations could charge for their services. So there is an interplay there, but I'm seeing it more as this gives the commission flexibility rather than taking flexibility out of your hands.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, the situation I'm thinking about is let's say that the utility charges 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and we'll simplify it. That's just how much they charge. And the developer charges 9 cents a kilowatt hour. And all of a sudden, the subscribers receive the benefit of this subsidy. And so the subscribers are now able to afford more because they're receiving a subsidy. That gives the developer more flexibility to then charge 10 cents a kilowatt hour, right? And so, well, I guess in that situation, it doesn't change where the energy provider that the customer is choosing. It kind of makes them indifferent, but really what it's doing is providing an opportunity for the developer to indirectly extract the benefit of that. I'd have to think through the numbers to make the analogy work a little bit better, but I think you see what I'm saying is indirectly, if you're giving $5 to a subscriber, and then they're having to turn around and pay those $5 to the developer, the subscriber technically is receiving those $5, but then they're having to pay them, and they're no better or worse off, but the developer in that situation is, if they're receiving those $5.
Okay, I'll just remind the commission that every single one of the projects that was selected for this offers an at least 25 to 27% discount to low-income customers.
Yeah.
So the low-income customers are not going to lose that benefit no matter what we do, unless the project just isn't feasible and can't make it, and then some other project would have to serve that. So while I understand your concern, I don't think that my position is that there is no subsidy, and that we're really just setting up a process in case something happens that we weren't aware of that would raise the costs to the utilities. But we went through what it actually costs to run this program in the tariffs case, and the administration portion of it is quite minimal. So I guess our facilitators and the commission advisory staff We'll work very closely with the commissioners so that you understand these proposals, and you are free to help refine these. I mean, before we put out a NOPR, that's what really this whole workshop is about, is so that you understand it and can provide further guidance in order to make the process for the NOPR a lot more streamlined.
Yeah, and I do also want to. I want to highlight that um, I agree with the reading about the benefits to low income customers. I see that very clearly in the Community Solar Act, and um, I agree with it. I'm somebody who grew up in a really poor community, and so I it's a lot easier for me to find that a subsidy is in the public interest if it's helping low income. It's trickier for me to find that a subsidy is in the public interest if it's really helping the developers. And so that's kind of the what I would encourage we would be able to solve here. And I recognize Commissioner Nyberg's point that some people would be paying more, that some other people would benefit. I think the law allows for that, and I think we can disagree on whether that's the right approach or not, but I think that is the will of the legislature here, and so that's what would make me feel more comfortable. The other thing, which is why I was asking whether this applies generally or project by project, is the other thing is I think the legislature also wanted us to make this program work. So if the subsidy is needed to make the program work, in other words, if the developers weren't making enough money to actually be interested to build these projects, then I think the subsidy would also be in the public interest in order to carry out the will of the legislature here by making the program work. Those are the things that I'm considering. Commissioner Nybert had another comment or question he wanted to note.
Yeah, Arthur, the issue of administrative costs and things were brought up in our budget meetings, and since the PRC is receiving a one-time fee, we're trying to figure out how to modify that so that there's an income stream coming in to administer the program. So, we're looking at maybe doing some things that are going to increase some of those costs of administering the program in the long run. Because right now, my understanding is there's a one-time payment to go through the process, and then we don't receive anything after that. But we still have cost of administration on our end that's not being captured. So we're trying to internally figure out how to capture the cost of administration. So you might see some of that coming through to address one of the comments you made.
Yes, and I agree that the funding mechanism that the legislature gave us was very difficult, and we immediately had to go back and ask for a special appropriation in order to begin the program. And then the only mechanism that we had to pay for the commission's costs was through the assessing of application fees on projects that were selected and moving into interconnection things. That is not a sustainable mechanism at all. And so I wholly support whatever the commission can do to get the legislature to revisit that, but it's kind of out of our hands. But thank you, and thank you for your consideration.
May I add one thing?
Go ahead. Thank you.
Yes. So concerns about allowing subsidization will cause more money to flow to developers. I would point out that delivering benefits to low income and other customers is one of the criteria the RFP is selecting for. And so bidders are literally bidding to provide the highest level of benefits. And I think that certainly places a limitation on any expectation that subsidies are going to just benefit developers. People have to compete to get these projects, and how much you benefit subscribers and low income is high up there in the ranking.
Thank you. Turn it over to Mr. Fisk to keep us moving forward. Appreciate
Thank you.
your presentation.
Thank you, Stephanie. So next on the agenda, we have proposal 4 from Working Group 1, the evaluation of unsubscribed energy. And again, we have Mike Setledge from SPS.
Thank you. That's much better. I'm glad to cover this topic as well. I'll try to be as brief as I can. I think this is fairly straightforward. There wasn't a lot of controversy on this. Basically, the proposal says, in a nutshell, we're going to use our existing mechanisms that we already have for settling DG payments to customers. So it's not reinventing the wheel. It's using systems that are already in place. There aren't additional costs to develop something different. Another key point is that all 3 of the utilities have slightly different ways of doing this, but they all use an avoided cost LMP type technique to come up with this. But there are slight differences. PNM is on a 3-month cycle with these updates. I'm sorry, PNM is on a quarterly update. Wait a minute, no, sorry. I'm thinking about fuel. PNM does this once a year, and they publish all 12 months worth once a year of what this rate will be. It is based on 1 year previous history. The other 2 utilities look at more or less as it happens what that rate is and update that each month. So it's a little bit different, but they all have existing processes that are approved by the commission. And this proposal says use the existing processes. One of the things that's a key feature of this is the unsubscribed energy, if there ever is any, is compensated for at a lower rate than the solar bill credit would give them. So it's a disincentive, or it's an incentive for solar developers to get subscribers. I think everyone in the working group was in agreement that that was good. This energy should be subscribed. That's the whole purpose of the program. Because if it's not, the developers could have just built a regular DG plant and tried to do it that way as a perp or whatever. But it's not that. So this is intended to be at a lower rate to give them incentive. The way this proposal was written was to give developers many opportunities to subscribe this. If they can't use it the month of production, they have 12 more months to use it to get rid of this so that we minimize the quantity of energy that is being paid for. The unsubscribed energy is being paid for at this rate. And when it's all said and done, it was simplified to make it so that whenever, if you end up with some after 12 months, it's paid for with whatever the then current rates are per your existing methodology. The whole process was designed to streamline this and make it as simple as possible, not reinvent the wheel, and keep it moving forward. So using the then current rate. That's about as quickly as I could possibly go through that, but I might have gone too quickly, so I'm more than welcome to any questions.
And then can you explain whether this is, I'm sorry, I think you said this, whether this is controversial or contested, or is this a common position?
It was fairly common within us. I think one unique feature within the subgroups, there wasn't much, we had discussions, but we pretty much all came to this point pretty quickly, is my understanding. One thing that's unique about the New Mexico program, and maybe not unique, but it's uncommon, is most other community solar programs cash all this unsubscribed energy out at the end of each month. So there is no carry forward and no opportunity to reassign that. Program here tries to encourage that being reassigned, so none of it is ever cashed out. And if it is, it's sort of a stopgap at what they would get if they weren't a community solar site.
Okay, thank you. And don't mean to complicate the proposal, but I'll just tell you one reaction that I have is that in kind of aligned with, there's a little bit of a give and a take. I think that there's probably more giving from the community solar project here to the rest of the system than because if they're being compensated at the avoided cost, I think really what that means is they're being compensated for the energy, but not for the capacity that it's providing. And this is a project that the utility is required pursuant to the law to purchase. And so you have that capacity available to you. And so there's, if for the unsubscribed energy, the project is only being paid for the energy, then it's not being paid for the capacity that it's providing, which again, don't mean to complicate it, but I think there's, some give and take on both sides here. And so I see how this could be a reasonable approach that strikes a good balance between all the considerations.
There was clear consensus on the desire to have as little as possible of this unsubscribed energy left after 12 months. So we may be talking about a very small quantity of energy.
Yeah,
Everything
potentially.
as expected.
Yeah. Commissioner Nyberg, do you have any questions? Okay, so well, we've been discussing these. Were you planning for a discussion after? Was there questions you had? Or?
Mr. Chairman, no, we put discussion time there, but we've had discussion time throughout. So I don't think, unless anyone would like to have a discussion on, I think we generally have the discussion right along with the proposal, right after the proposal. I don't know if anyone wants to have any further discussion. Have a placeholder.
Yeah, and so maybe it's a good time for a break. So why don't we take almost, well, we can take 10 minutes. I have 10, 30. Okay, so let's be back at 10:47. Right, so we are back, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Fisk to continue to call the next presenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're moving on now to working group 2, which is concerned with project solicitation and evaluation. First, we have a presentation on proposal 1. This is a modified version of the scoring and ranking process that we have now in the rule. We have Dylan Connolly from Affordable Solar. Dylan, you can take it away.
Chairman, Commissioner, staff, stakeholders, my name is Dylan Connolly. I'm with Affordable Solar. I'm the Director of Development for Affordable Solar. We were selected for 7 community solar projects, and we turned on the first project in September for this phase 1. My capacity has been working with the rulemaking in phase 1, as well as participating in the RFP for phase 1. And then because community solar is only in New Mexico for our company, we're based in Albuquerque. This is something that I've taken a special interest in. So I'm the president of RIA and a member of CCSA. This version that we're going to discuss, and there are slides too as well. Okay, great. So we can go to the second slide. I can't see them, but I have them here. And within CCSA, which is mostly developers of community solar nationwide, what we attempted to do was to take the lessons learned from the phase 1 of community solar and apply those to a couple of different versions, potential versions for how phase 2's RFP could go. So we can go to the third slide now. What I'm going to discuss in this first session, and then I'll be back for another one, is what's called the CCSA version 1. The idea, you can go to the next one, the next slide here, 4. The idea, it was that we wanted to do minor modifications to the rule in order to allow the RFP for phase 2 to move more smoothly. Essentially, we wanted to minimize the amount of changes, strategically redlining the rule in order to speed up the process, in order to have the next RFP come out with minimal changes and allow it to be coming out more expediently. Sort of 3 main sections: sliding scale, which we'll talk about on phase 1. There was originally a sliding scale in the RFP, and then it was removed at the end. And then incorporating some lessons learned around local preference, local labor, and then lastly, increasing transparency on the scores post-award, as well as transparency for utility timelines and process, so that folks on the waitlist would have an understanding of where they sit in the queue. We can go to slide 5. So if you're looking at sliding scale scoring in the PowerPoint here, the RFP took a few liberties to embellish on the rule in the RFP. And so one of those things was to say that several of the subjective criteria would be scored on a sliding scale. What that did is it promoted competition between developers to provide additional community benefits beyond the baseline. The RFP was run, projects were submitted under that sliding scale. After award, there was a petition to read the rule more exactly. And that petition came in front of the commission. The commission read that the subjective criteria said that points would be awarded for partnerships, meaning all or nothing. So that applied to workforce training, that applied to partnerships with local community, tribes, pueblos, and then applied to the innovative commitment. So projects that scored 1 out of 5 for those sections were bumped up to 5 out of 5, essentially making nearly all the scores pretty similar across the board, despite various differences between actual benefits to the community. So what we're proposing is sort of a very simple, instead of shall be awarded, changing it to an up to 5 points for innovative commitment, 6 points for workforce training, and 6 points, up to 6 points for the partnerships. It changed dramatically which projects were selected. I would say it didn't change dramatically which projects were selected and not selected, but it did change the order in which they were selected in, which affected how they were selected on a substation, for example, if you were first or second priority. We can go to the next slide. One of the next major points that I wanted to point out was the local preference. In the original rulemaking, and the original RFP, there's essentially 3 or 4 sections that deal with local. Taking some tea leaves from what the actual act had said around looking for local preference, as well as promoting local developers and selection and enriching the local workforce, essentially. So in the original scoring, as long as the project was owned by a local company, it could be considered fully local. Incline embellished on and created some additional clarity, not Incline, but the RFP writer, and then Incline ran the RFP in this way. However, it didn't require that the local company have any experience in solar. And so there was an option to essentially have a local company submit for another company with experience. And so a lot of debate back and forth, hundreds of hours of developers trying to work together and create consensus. And that's sort of the end result of what we're looking at. So we can go to the next slide here. And sort of what we wanted to come up with was a new methodology for combining experience of the local company in renewables, so that you're not able to essentially either buy a small company that's New Mexico based or ask them to submit for you. That company actually would need to have experience in renewables in order to be given the points in the RFP. And so this section sort of gives 2 paths. Because it was worth 8 to 10 points for local preference, and the total score is around 100 points. If you didn't have local preference, you didn't win. So very experienced developers who didn't choose to go down this path were not selected. So essentially what the next round would look like if we didn't make this change was everyone would just kind of do that loophole. So the idea here is to create a separate path for experienced developers who are not local to New Mexico to still be able to use their experience in renewable energy towards the RFP scoring, but also if they partner with a local business, they can have an additive partnership as opposed to a hollow partnership. And so that's this concept. And if we can go to the next slide here. The local. So this is a graph or a chart here that's pretty helpful in terms of understanding this. An experienced resident business that was not a veteran business could score up to 18 points in the original version, whereas a local veteran business with little or no experience could score 20 points, essentially beating out an experienced local company. Whereas an out-of-state company could, at best, if they did a joint venture 50-50, they'd only get 8 points under Section 8. So you can kind of see here the different points in phase one. And then if you look down to the next column here, or the next section under phase two, the new proposal would be that an experienced local company would score 23 points in that first column, whereas a less experienced company with little to no solar experience would score lower, 15 points, and a company with no experience, just a shell company of sorts, would score 10 points. Whereas in the next column, I probably could have labeled these columns for you, but column 4, out-of-state experience plus a partnership, they would score 20 points, which would be just under what a local company with experience would score. So this was a methodology to work within the existing rules with minor changes to ensure that there were more likely to be partnerships that were real with real solar companies in New Mexico if the out-of-state companies wanted to partner. Next slide. So this, I just want to point out there are a couple in the CCSA version of alternates, section 2 being one of those alternates. And this was just the alternate B here is saying that we're not allowing the shell companies from phase 1 to be given experience points from phase 1 when so as opposed to really focusing on projects that happen before phase 1. We can go to the next section. So now we should be looking at 2B, local construction. This is another one of those alternates I want to point out. This is with regards to local construction. In phase 1, there was this language, only materials, supplies, and services performed by local businesses. And there was 6 points for that. What we did here is we found that was a little confusing. And so we've fixed that to be about the engineering and construction services being locally done and performed directly by those local businesses, as opposed to just a pass through of sorts. So this language here was what the industry came up with. Alternate B is another a bit adding even more localness to it. The concept in the original B was that you could just be operated locally or operated by a racial minority, and the barrier was very low. Didn't really push to have New Mexico-based contractors building for you when essentially there were loopholes. We can go to the next slide.
Dylan, I'm sorry. I just wanted to know, on 2B that you had there, I have that as alternate 6B. And by the way, I did reformat some of these, so maybe that's what, but that's actually what it is on here, 6B.
Yeah,
just so you
6.
know.
Yeah.
It said 6B. I'm sorry.
I wrote number 2,
Okay.
second section, but it was section 6B.
I see that now.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was confused. You have it right.
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks for clarifying. I think we're looking at number 3, transparency. Folks really wanted to understand how they scored and where they ranked before and after. And so that was really important, as well as they wanted to understand if their project was second in the queue on a substation, how is the other project advancing? So essentially, Russell, Mr. Fisk has just recently done a bench request for feedback from the utilities on interconnection status. So this builds that in to the rule that on a quarterly basis, the utilities will provide those updates on that. Next slide. We worked really hard to try and come up with a methodology for scoring projects based on interconnection viability. And that proved to be something basically not feasible within the constructs of the RFP. There was feedback from a lot of the other states about unintended consequences of trying to apply a dollar value from the utilities for certain types of upgrades. And there was just not really a good methodology for incorporating that into a rulemaking. What we did find as a group is that there's a lot of lessons learned from developers in phase 1 on looking at the pre-application feedbacks on site feasibility and not locating projects in a way that they would need $5 to $10 million upgrades. I think seeing what phase one projects cost is going to give them a lot of feedback to site projects in a much better way. And related to that was if you were the second project selected on a good feeder, you now have a much more expensive feeder upgrade, but you were given more points than somebody else. And so there wasn't a way to have that second order of understanding of if there's another project selected before you, now you have a bad interconnection. So that's the reason why that was left out. And there is a decent amount of time that takes to complete this process. I'll talk about that a little bit more. We go to the last slide here, the pros. This version of the RFP really thoughtfully looked at every word in the rule and how it had consequences in the RFP the first time, and tried to do very strategic edits, minimal edits, so that, and then have those edits reviewed for hundreds of hours within the developer group and then in the stakeholder working groups with feedback from Incline and the utilities and others. So I think it does a great job of doing a light touch, and that's was the attempt here. Any questions?
Thank you for that presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about the interconnection, the information that you have as a developer about what it'll cost to interconnect. Because it seems to me that we're all better off if the developers have more information when they're selecting a site with respect to interconnection costs. And so it sounded, based off of the second to last slide, that you didn't find maybe a good way to incorporate that. And what I want to make sure is that we are selecting sites that are more cost effective. For, you know, when you consider all of the costs together and maybe the production that, you know, the project will have and the cost of the interconnection. And so is there anything in here that helps with that by providing more information, or can you speak to that?
What we attempted to do was to request that the utilities put a good faith estimate, you know, rough order of magnitude. Is this a $1 million upgrade, $2 million upgrade, $10 million upgrade? And in discussions with the utilities, them to add that, the extra administrative burden was fairly high. It feels though we landed as an industry and with the utilities that the experience and the lessons learned from phase one allow us to read these pre-applications much more efficiently. And so we're attempting to not put projects on these poor locations. You can still do your best and pick a good location, but if there's another project selected before you, it's now not a good location. I think solving it on the back end is actually probably the right way to do it, which is the version 4, which we'll talk about. Another way to do that. The other thing I think that's going to solve this is the ITC cliff with the tax credits. So projects that have safe harbored material are able to, as long as they complete projects in 2029 or 2030, are able to take advantage of the tax credits. For these phase 2 projects, if you're bidding in, you have a methodology for getting the tax credits. However, if you find you need a substation upgrade and that substation is going to take 2 years, you aren't likely to be able to move forward with that project because now you're probably not going to finish in time. So there's a bit of a self-selection that should be happening anyways based on that.
And so it seems though then that we would receive more applications and then the developers go and get more information, they figure it out, and then they're not financially viable, and then we have to reshuffle. Just from my more perspective, being like a little further back and looking at this, that seems less efficient than if you're able to identify sites and then pick developers based on their, whatever selection criteria.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There were 407 submissions in the first round, and that represents probably around 100 developers. Each of those developers submitted anywhere from 20 to 50 requests for site status information from the utilities. We're talking about, thousands of requests for information. If the utilities were to study those to the point of getting to a pretty good price, it's just a non-tenable amount of work. So it's trying to figure out which project, it's a chicken and the egg thing. Which one do you do first? And as I mentioned, I think projects are really viable with some feeder upgrades and some protections, anywhere from $700,000 to $2 million. Projects start not being viable when they need a substation upgrade, and that's very clear in the pre-applications. It says right there, there's no capacity left on the substation, and what I would expect developers to do is to walk away from those sites.
Mr. Conley, you started off with lessons learned, and one lesson that I think I learned, or the commission's learned, is what happens when the proposed developer got all these points for checking certain boxes. And then it comes time to begin the project, and some of those boxes could not have been checked. What is the recourse? Should they lose the opportunity to build the project? Should somebody else have been awarded it? And do your changes address that issue?
Working group 2 focused on section 12, and that section does not get into what you described, but there is another section, I believe section 16, where industry and stakeholders agreed to add extra language around the commitments that are made and enforceability around those commitments.
So ultimately, somewhere in this, there's some application of that lesson learned, because we came very close a few meetings ago to having to deal with that. Second question on lessons learned, maybe it's premature, maybe it ought to be in the next section that you're going to do, but in citing, it seems that we have areas of the state that have unique attributes, whether lack of population, lack of demand for electricity, what have you. And yet, some of these community solar sites may want to be sited in those locations, and the utility doesn't have the there to service it. Is there anything in there that gives somebody the opportunity to look at the actual facts on the ground as to the ability of the system to deal with 5 megawatts of energy coming on at a particular location and impact overall?
Yeah, what you're describing is an effective tax credit policy, actually. So with the IRA, there was an extra 10% bonus tax credit associated with locating projects in what's called energy communities. And so energy communities is essentially a multitude of items, but really what it boiled down to was if you cited projects in more rural locations, then you got a 10% bonus tax credit. So a plethora of projects located their projects in Clayton, Deming, Lordsburg, Alamogordo, places that had generally smaller populations and smaller loads. So it just happened to be that that was a bigger push to put those projects there for that reason. What those folks found out was that if you then needed a $10 million upgrade, that 10% extra tax credit wasn't helping your viability. There's not an express methodology for that in this RFP, but again, it's something that feels as though it's going to work itself out because Deming already needs a substation upgrade. Silver City's got issues that developers are finding. Projects aren't viable. Developers in the next round are looking for sites that won't need substation upgrades and that have capacity to wield the power. Likewise with Clayton, we're having a wielding issue with needing to, I think they peak at around 1.5 MW daytime load. So the 5 MW project is going to be backfeeding onto transmission PNM doesn't own. And so who pays for that? I think those types of considerations are, it's not feasible to write into a rule, but they're going to work themselves out as a developer. You're going to want to locate projects in a place that can be built.
Well, I'd push back a little bit. I do think we need to put something in the rule to deal with that because we can't be putting in these facilities in locations that already have similar facilities that are providing as much or more than needed in that community. So, you know, you not only have line losses and all that stuff, but just doesn't make sense. And frankly, I would say that it goes against the spirit of the statute. There's a reason why you can't co-locate 2 community solar facilities next to one and have the same interconnection. Reason that occurred, that was to try to spread these out where there was demand for the energy. And so, you know, having, take Lordsburg or Hidalgo County, you put, you know, 4 or 5 community solar facilities in Hidalgo County, which is a great place to put solar. But that area of the state cannot absorb, does not demand that amount of electricity. We have a problem, as I see it. And so I would hope that there's some resolution or at least some guidance to incline that location matters and the facts as they exist on the ground matter and the demand for energy matters because otherwise maybe it gets somebody a tax credit, but it's going to cost ratepayers somewhere more money than they otherwise should have to pay if it were located in a different part of the state, maybe within the same company's service area, but in a different geographic location. So, you know, I think lessons learned, the handwriting's on the wall that you can't overload Southwest New Mexico with community solar. Can't overload, you mentioned Alamogordo, you can't overload Otero County with community solar unless they have, you know, Alamogordo's a much bigger place than Lordsburg, but, you know, there may be some limitations there, although getting energy to El Paso is probably fairly easy from Otero County. And, you know, I'm going to talk about Northeast New Mexico, but there's other parts of the state where there's a reason, and there's a reason that the co-ops were exempted. It was a recognition that some co-ops couldn't handle it, just flat out couldn't handle it. So, you know, I think that's an important attribute and certainly something that I think it ought to be a lesson learned. And somebody who's proposing, you know, the 5th or 6th community solar facility in Hidalgo County, maybe they shouldn't get as many points in their bid as somebody putting it closer to where the demand and to be easier interconnection. So I don't know if somewhere else we deal with that, but that's certainly one lesson that I think is very apparent from what we've seen. You know, hope that our rules moving forward will squarely address that. Thank you.
Yeah, and to that point, I just want to note that I mean it probably depends on the system that exists already. I'm sure it's harder if you're on a radio line, but um, it really depends on the flows because not you can export that energy to somewhere else. So I think it'll just depend on the specific circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, the interconnection process is where that sorts itself out. It's if you propose a project in a place that can handle it, then the utility charges you appropriately, and that project's borne by the interconnecting company. And if the fourth and fifth project in Deming isn't viable because it's $10 million more, then the utility should charge appropriately to the developers. And we'd love to have hosting capacity maps that told you each location, and we could set a policy that just says the minimum hosting capacity is X, but those things are still years away from happening in New Mexico. So in the meantime, what we're left with is sort of a unpack and get feedback from the pre-application process, which if developers are utilizing that should tell them good and bad locations.
And from your experience, have the utilities been able to provide like a non-binding rough estimate of the interconnection costs?
It's something we talked about with the utilities. It's something that they're open to. It's not something that's currently in statute anywhere in rule that's asking them to do that. There was willingness, there was interest. It ended up not being something that we pushed as part of this process to conclusion.
Is that something that would benefit the program?
I think that's something that would benefit all the pre-apps, all the projects that are interested in interconnecting if they had a ballpark number. There's a lot of logistics associated with the accuracy of that number and how is the utility held to that number? What if they take another look and the price is doubled? How are they held to account? The utilities are going to want to know that they're not going to be held liable for an estimate on a short-term basis.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree with that if they're not performing a thorough study. I would agree that they should not be held to that estimate. I think once somebody is paying for a study and you expect it to be correct, then well, that's different. But
right.
If you're just asking for a rough estimate, I wouldn't agree with it being a binding estimate. Okay. Just from a very, very high level, I would assume that if we knew where it was cheapest to interconnect, the service that the subscribers are subscribing to might be less expensive for them. And that's why I'm asking those questions. So I did want to ask though about timing. So at our last meeting, we received a public comment about the tax credits expiring and urgency with respect to finalizing the rule. Can you speak to that? Because you also mentioned something about if you have materials on hand, then maybe there's a different tax rate. Can you just kind of explain some of that to me?
Sure. There's a process called safe harbor where it's a tax policy that's not just related to renewable energy. where if you make a material purchase of a product, you are subject to the tax law at the time that that product was purchased. And so when the HR1 was passed, they essentially curtailing tax credits for projects that are not turned on before 2027. That's only if you start construction later. But if you're able to quote unquote start construction through either purchase of material or start of offsite construction, that's via purchasing a transformer, for example, for the project, then you're able to utilize the tax law at the time. So what that means is you have 4 years after that point to complete the project. So
After which point?
After the safe harbor event. So after you make that purchase. So for example, if a project purchased equipment this year, they would have, it's 2025, they would have 4 years. They would have until the end of the calendar year, the 4th year, meaning 2029. So if we were able to complete this process in a timely manner, if we get the RFPs complete, projects would have, let's say we're running by late 2026, projects would have 3 years to bring projects online before the end of 2029 in order to utilize the tax credits. Our project from selection until being turned on, the first one was just over 2 years, to give you an idea of timeline. We're hopeful that utility timelines will be a little bit more expedient. I think they will. The utilities have indicated that they've set up the processes to be able to review this many and this size project more expediently, as well as having them purchase some of the common equipment earlier so that they can be ready for all these projects in a row. If there's a concept called FIAC, it's foreign entities concern. That is something that's tagged on to projects that start construction in 2026. That's unknown right now how that's going to work, but that essentially means that you can't be buying equipment from China and places like Russia and others. That would allow, if you start in 2026, that would allow you to finish by 2030. So you'd have the extra year to complete. So as long as by then we can figure out the foreign entities of concern issue with our equipment and our purchases, then projects would have until 2030 to come online and still utilize full tax credits the way they are right now. So these projects in phase 2 are viable based on the tax credits. We do hope that this rulemaking can happen expediently, the RFP can happen expediently, so that we are more sure that we can complete within 3 or 4 years of being selected.
And so can you define more clearly what you mean by expediently?
I think for us, knowing, having a schedule that's set out, right? So if the rulemaking was to come out later this year, or the rule for review, then we have an idea of the commission's goals for completion of that, and then we have an idea that, say, the RFP needs to be part of rewriting this RFP with a light touch is that the new RFP could be small changes more quickly in for approval. And then some of these versions, like the first come, first serve, do away with the RFP to try and shorten the timeline as well. I think we feel if you can complete the rulemaking in the amount of time that's statutorily required, maybe with a little bit of buffer, we can finish the RFP in a couple of months, and then there's a couple of months for the RFP to be run, there's a couple of months for the RFP to be reviewed, projects selected late 26. We feel that projects are viable to be finished by 2029 or 2030 with the added restrictions of foreign entities of concern.
Do you think it would be a benefit to increase the application fee? So, there's a higher bar to submit an idea, and therefore there there would be fewer entries into the RFP and less to evaluate for us, and maybe allow it to be run more quickly?
Um, I would say that the cost barrier is probably not the prohibitive value. So I think if you were to raise that, I think that that's, essentially a tax on the program, but it's not a one that would be burdensome to the point where we would see a decrease in project submissions. The barrier to submit a project, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars per project worth of ministerial permits, non-ministerial permits, site control, land options, lawyers, consultants, preliminary drawings. The added, you're fairly committed when you're doing that work, and even if a higher fee wouldn't slow that down.
So are you doing all of that work before you're selected, or after?
Before, yeah, there's 407 projects that were submitted. Each of those had anywhere from 20 to $150,000 worth of work per developer. So there's an economic there's a lot of economic work there, and that's also why the developers are so focused on the RFP, because they're looking for a fair process that the best project does win from, and that there's not loopholes that are exploited by some.
Thank you. Okay. Russell?
Thank you, Dylan. Next up, proposal 2 for working group 2, called Lessons Learned. We have Adam Harper of OE Solar. Adam, you can take it away.
Hello again, Commission. My name is Adam Harper, CEO and founder of OE Solar. And I'm here today to present a RFP refinement and a true lessons learned from phase 1 that I have been able to work and discuss with other local developers that were awarded in phase 1, as well as low-income subscriber organizations, nonprofits, and other stakeholders. So this proposal is a collaborative effort from true local New Mexicans with local benefit and kind of the statutorial, I would say, incentive that I believe was drafted when the Community Solar Act was implemented. So I want to start off with saying is that everything that you guys have heard today is somewhat true. And you're going to see a common theme that this is probably the most important section of the whole program, which is going to be project selection, partnership, as well as benefit to the economic landscape, not just in rural areas, but also in urban areas. And so this is why essentially this proposal is as in-depth as it is because it actually took a true lessons learned approach and really an autopsy on what worked, because there were some things that worked. As you heard, there was a significant amount of commitment to low-income subscribers. Most every single project that was awarded was committing to 50% LMI capacity at a 27.1% discount. So that's something that I think that worked relatively well. But what you also probably heard, and you've heard just recently, is that the partnerships and really actual, local labor and use of local contractors was something that didn't work quite so well. And so we see a lot of shell companies, or some folks categorize them as ice cream shops, which are essentially just sleeves for large out-of-state interests that is essentially just taking capacity away from the current IOUs and diverting that revenue to out-of-state accounts. And so this is where this proposal essentially kind of tries to address these things. And I believe someone had mentioned before is that everything in this proposal essentially could be interjected in any other proposal or reevaluated and rewrote. But this is more of a lessons learned to give the commission a true evaluation of what we believe worked well, what we think didn't work well. And then lastly is that you're hearing about essentially speed and efficiency to get these projects in the ground. And that's what this exactly does, is it creates only shovel-ready projects to be able to move forward. Because if you see here, and are my slides up? All right, sorry. Can you use next slide, please? So I've outlined essentially four categories of lessons learned from phase one. And I heard a lot of discussion. The main issue is speculative projects. That was the biggest issue, is that there was 406 or 407 projects submitted that the administration had to evaluate, had to review. And that all just takes time when only 40 some projects were awarded. And so I think that right there shows that was our major issue is just the sheer volume of projects needing to be evaluated. And then the next thing is that scoring ambiguity. And as you see is there was a lot of kind of loose language. There's a lot of gray area in there, which is good for essentially writing law and different things. But when you're trying to do a RFP kind of apples to apples comparison, it's really hard to compare something when it may not be identical to each other to see where that best value might be lying. And so that was the second place that we've seen that this proposal here essentially addresses. The third is document gaps. And so again, you've heard that there was a lot of speculative or well-intentioned commitments, but all those were non-binding. And so again, anyone that works in some kind of administrative setting knows that if things aren't spelled out, agreements aren't essentially tied up with terms and conditions, that's just going to slow the process once it gets going. And so that was another place that we've seen was a potential issue. And then lastly is the local benefit dilution. And so as you heard, there were projects and developers and partnerships that were formed in phase one that, all honesty, those local partners, they shouldn't have been awarded those projects because they didn't obtain or have the experience to be able to perform those. And so what that ends up doing is that, for instance, OE Solar, we employ folks. We've been doing this since 2009. We work with the state. We have the ability to do this. And we're employing our local folks, which come from Santa Fe, New Mexico, Espanola. And when you have these other entities that are able to utilize, let's say, a veteran-ran solar contractor from Florida building projects in Clovis, that's revenue and jobs that are being performed by out-of-state folks that Clovis non-suppliers or non-participants that may not participate in the program but work for the civil company that is grading those projects, they're missing out on that. And that's essentially not what I think that the Community Solar Act actually intended for. But that was the reality of where we're at now because of essentially the kind of loose requirements that nothing needed to really be binding. And there were some well-intentioned, just, I guess, missteps when drafting that language. Next slide, please. So what this does is, and what these amendments is, it tries to take a holistic approach to refining the current RFP process. My firm has been working with the state's procurement statutes and RFP entities for 16 plus years. And I don't believe that an RFP cannot be well ran. I've seen it, and I believe that the state has a significant amount of experience performing well-crafted RFPs. But we also do have some challenges that the state just inherently has. And you've heard it, that there are statutory requirements that certain things just take a certain amount of time, and there's no faster way to do that. But looking at other programs in other states, you've seen, and you're going to hear later about essentially bypassing an RFP process and moving to what's called a standard offer. There's definitely some benefits to that. It allows for speed, but what you'll see is that the consequence is that it erodes local benefit because it favors large corporations that have a lot of money that can essentially click the button faster or have more sites that you heard, submit 50 sites instead of 30. And so that's, again, I think, not in line with what this program, at least in this state, is trying to achieve. But what this proposal does is creates a dual track process. So utilizing the competitive RFP for large projects and making sure that they're shovel ready. So we're not getting 406 speculative projects. You're getting every single project is ready to go, binding agreements, and if it is awarded, it could hit the ground running and move into construction as soon as possible. But with some of those limitations and seeing that programs in this industry have evolved to this standard offer project or option, is that we're proposing to create a pilot project for standard offer, kind of like what we did in this first initial RFP, is saying, you know what, let's try this. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. But creating a standard offer pilot for 1.5 megawatt AC projects and lower. And how we had concluded the size has to do with essentially H1's tax credits kind of threshold. They said that 1.5 mega AC and under, they're going to treat differently than projects that are, let's say, 5 megawatts. But is that using the standard offer as a pilot, and what we had concluded is let's maybe start with 10% of the total capacity available. So for instance, in phase 2, that would be 30 megawatts. But since then, we've seen some things move on the tax credit and kind of at the federal level where that capacity cap could be essentially eliminated, even though you're still utilizing that kind of smaller threshold of project size at 1.5 mega to try to incentivize more projects to be able to capture those tax credits, but also allow smaller developers that may be entry level that want to get in, which is a part of the intention of the statute is to broaden or bring in more New Mexico companies that want to participate, as well as nonprofits and community-led projects. Because some of these entities that want to do this, as you've heard, may not have the $150,000 up front to just put together and spend on a speculative project that they may not be even scored and picked up on. So it's kind of, this evolution, but I would say forward-thinking process that New Mexico could, kind of take and not essentially reinvent the wheel, but do both things at once and see that if this standard offer does work and there are some particular guardrails that need to be implemented to ensure that the program is achieving the statutory requirements that it is, this is a good way to do that. Next slide. And so based on these amendments that we're proposing, really at bidding, so this is pre-submission, is that it's going to essentially create more accountability and it's going to solidify readiness if awarded. And so it would require roughly just 5 things, is that it's going to have binding contracts. Again, we had touched on that before. It has site control as well as other site-specific ministerial permit requirements. Interconnection proof, which I'd like to touch a little bit more on that later, but this is one of the only proposals that takes into account to Commissioner Aguilar's question earlier, is there something that can be done between the project developers and the utilities that will help maybe site these projects in better places? And so this is one that proposes that. As well as it tightens up essentially verification of ownership. And it does have some language in there that it eliminates and it explicitly states that sleeves or pass-through companies would be excluded from this. And so if there was any kind of conclusion or investigation that had concluded that there was a partnership that wasn't truly a partnership and it was a sleeve, that it does allow and states what could potentially happen moving forward to that company. So it's a little bit of a deterrent as well. And then lastly, essentially, it builds on some more citing, specific citing incentives. So not only does it take into account how do we interpret the data that we do have much better to make sure that we're citing these projects in better locations, but again, to Commissioner Aguilar as a economist, it puts a little incentive. So it's not just, hey, this is a really good place to do this, but you know what? Let's also, if you put it here where there may be more cost or more challenges, there's an additional incentive to cite these projects and locations that could probably use these projects more. And so again, these amendments are a holistic approach to what needs to be done. But again, they could be utilized or edited to any NOPR or any additional workshop. Next slide, please. So this is just going through some of the clarifying observations that that is in the report. And I won't get too much into this. This is something that I believe that the commission and staff can read, but that this is portrayed as the amendments that have the most opposition. But I will point out that the survey had a total of 14 respondents. So I don't think that while the survey was definitely helpful and informative, I don't think that it was a true observation or perspective of the broader community solar stakeholder group. Next slide, please. So if the commission did accept or approve these amendments, that the results would be is that we would have significantly more transparency because we would require the documentation to be completed and binding up front. So then there is no interpretation later of what was meant or what was agreed upon. Second is that it's going to ensure the maximum amount of local benefit, which again, we were talking earlier about subsidy. This is something that if there was bound to be a subsidy concluded, ensuring that any of that revenue or subsidies or benefits are going to New Mexicans, regardless if you're participating or not participating. And then 3, it makes the program align better with what the statute and the intentions of that statute was. Next slide, please. So lastly, why this approach? And I don't want to belabor the point, but is that it creates a forward thinking process by creating a dual tracked approach. By creating that dual track approach, we believe that it can increase the participation as well as the amount of projects that could be implemented before the ITC is ran out. It improves the efficiency of the program because again, everything is having to be concluded and completed up front before submitting. And then lastly, it creates this balanced approach between large developers and joint ventures that are looking for potentially, 75 megawatts of capacity avoidance with a standard offer community-led based approach through that standard offer approach. And so we're able to see kind of both of those by maximizing the program itself and the capacity that the commission has awarded, but also seeing what else can be done with some of that capacity, as well as how a potential standard offer would potentially work. Next slide. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I do thank you for your time, and I would like to jump into the report to some of the red lines. So then we could talk a little bit more about those citing or pre-application information that could be utilized, as well as some of the additional citing incentives. So if you could scroll down to, I believe it's page 24, but it would be section 11 of our amendments. Yeah, this is on the report that I believe was sent out. Well, while we're waiting, let me go ahead and talk a little bit about, we'll back up to the pre-applications. And
Well,
so
we have it here.
Oh, okay.
And I'll forward it to Patrick, and he could go to page 24. And so I think we could get started, and
Okay.
Patrick could catch up.
All right. Well, let's start with section 5, which deals with the pre-application reports. And so what that does is that in these amendments, this was something that you'd heard earlier, John Gardner from XL Energy had participated in this work group. And so I took it upon myself to try to work with John Gardner in trying to evaluate what information is on a pre-app, what's really useful, and how could we leverage some of that information? Because to the earlier point, coming up to some kind of cost value is going to be relatively hard to do and time consuming, as well as that's just a snapshot in time, which can change the minute that the document is provided. But by looking at the pre-app and providing additional clarity around what should be evaluated in that pre-app. So this takes it one step further and says, this information is on the pre-app, but also what should you look for on that pre-app? And then to administrator, how do they look at it if they're not an electrical engineer or someone in here and say, well, how do I conclude what is more important or what provides me a sense of analysis that this project may be more viable based on this pre-app than something else. And so I want to thank John for this because this was very helpful, but it breaks down the pre-app into a point structure. And so currently it just states that if you have a pre-app and you've paid $300 or $500 for the pre-app, box is checked, but it could say you have zero capacity and you need, additional upgrades of lines, but it doesn't give any dollar amount, but it says essentially what the capacity is there. And under the current rules is that that's okay, because as long as you commit to paying the $10 million, then it's just as good as if I have a pre-app for a project that says it's got 10 megawatts of capacity and that the lines are more than big enough. And so this was one thing that we had concluded in this amendments that probably needs to be changed. But how do we evaluate this for a program administrator? And so one is taking into account not just the distance of three-phase, that's definitely important, but two, what is the transformer capacity on the current substation now? And so that's on a pre-app. And it states in these amendments, I have between 15 MVA and 20 MVA, that's 2 points. Between 21 MVA and 50 MVA, that's 3 points. And a transformer at a substation that has 50 MVA and larger, that's 4 points. So again, I could be an attorney that works in regulatory, and I could look at this and see that the pre-app says 50 MVA and this project is 5 megawatts. That's essentially an easy way to say that, you know what? Someone else has concluded that that is equaling four points, which is probably the best outcome. And so I would go ahead and give that project 4 points instead of trying to interpret what MVA actually even stands for. The next thing is in a pre-app is looking at essentially the voltages. Now it states that all of these projects have to be on distribution and not transmission. And so distribution comes in at essentially 1247 kV. That's a standard. But if you have a project, and again, here, this breaks down, 13.2, that's probably a standard voltage more for rural and some urban legacy projects. So again, it's giving the administrators some insight to what these values mean and where they're probably located. But all the way up to essentially 34.5 kV, which is usually the distribution backbone, and it's in rural areas. But again, these preliminary markers are good indicators that the infrastructure there is going to be able to handle, or that it's more than large enough to be able to handle the project with minimal upgrades. And so, again, taking kind of this holistic approach of what we have and how can we interpret this better, that was one area there where I was able to work with other stakeholders in the group that had much better experience and knowledge into that particular subsection than I did, and was able to integrate some of this into these red lines approach. And so if I could skip to section 11, this is talking about essentially the incentives for siting. So now that we understand how to interpret the pre-apps, that's still fine, but it doesn't say that if I have a pre-app that has, zero capacity, that I still couldn't submit the project. And again, going back to lessons learned, the speculative projects was the larger issue. So section 11 is not new to the current rule, but essentially it's expanded and refined on. And so, again, talking to some of the folks and listening to some of the other stakeholders is that was kind of the issue is that, there were incentives to site these, 5 megawatt projects at the end of the line in a greenfield that maybe not close to anybody. And so it did have some benefit or added points for site location, but this kind of expands on that. So section 11 is a total of 8 points. And again, if I could just remind the commission, almost all of the projects in phase 1 were separated by less than 5 points. I mean, it was the point structures were really quite close. So every point counts when it's being determined awarded projects or non-awarded. But 11A, it proposes 5 points for projects that are sited on brownfields, which I think we would all agree is a good use of space, but also previously developed. I heard earlier that there may have been a tax requirement to site it in energy communities, but if I could find a old, coal strip mine plant that maybe switched to gas and they have an extra 40 or 50 acres that I could utilize, that's a pre-developed site that I think that would definitely be a good use of space, as well as existing environments like roof types and existing buildings. And that kind of goes more towards essentially anti-heating, because we know that concrete and asphalt absorbs heat, which then increases electricity costs. So if we could put solar systems on rooftops and incentivize that so the building doesn't get as hot so the AC doesn't have to run, well, that's kind of just being much more efficient in siting. And just kind of skipping through here, the next one is for existing and new parking lots, as well as the last one, and this had to do with new construction, is also if you're going to integrate this into, let's say, a very large data center, there could be essentially some point structure to say, well, if you're developing this large data center in southern New Mexico and you want to partner with a community solar facility, so we could essentially piggyback not just the infrastructure going there, but also keep that building from consuming as much power, let's give you a few more points for that. And so that, again, is just one of the things that this essential red lines and these proposed amendments do that the other ones just don't achieve. And so with that, I will conclude my presentation of the lessons learned to site selection and and projects, and I will open it up for questions.
Commissioner Everett, do you have a question?
Well, just following up on my prior conversation with Mr. Conley, Mr. Harper, I see some of these points, but I'm wondering if they really address the locational issues that we've seen and have been alerted to as to areas of the state that may cause some problems, and whether these points that have been awarded, whether or not it really addresses some of those limitations or some of those problems that have crept up. And I guess I just encourage you to look at this again and see if there's some additional language that we need to put in to avoid some of the issues that this commission's having to wrestle with right now. And I can't get into it, but I'm sure you could talk to others and figure out how to award a point system that would discourage the location in areas that create problems for the commission, or increase the points for places that it may make more sense. So just throw that out there, deal with it as you wish, but I don't see the language that I would want to see in here that would really keep some of the issues from heading our way. And you know, this is a good place to cut some of those things off before they get the RFP awarded and start looking at building projects at some of those locations. So maybe take another look at it and see if there's something you could do to address some of the issues that we're having with right now. We appreciate it.
That's a great question, Commissioner. And what I would say to that is that while this proposed amendments may not address that language directly and say this XYZ, this is what you do. But what I would say is that being someone that graduated from Clayton High School, so if you go to high school, my face is hanging on the side wall there, is that I believe this is one of the other kind of indirect pertinent reasons why local partners and local developers should be at the forefront of the commission's intentions, because I could have told you that Clayton couldn't handle a 5 megawatt farm, right? I grew up there. We have one street light. And so I think that by ensuring that projects are awarded to the local industry, well, I was just at Brentley Lake, just south of Artesia yesterday. And so by having that kind of pertinent knowledge of what's here and what the distribution looks like. I mean, I believe myself and Mr. Connolly have probably installed projects in the Silver City area. We could have told you that that's a historical section of P&M's grid that is not any fault of their own, but it's just the reality of the situation, and that there's probably better places to site those. And so that's why I would say is that I will definitely take a look and try to work with other stakeholders to address this. But I think an indirect solution to that is making sure that shell companies and someone sitting in New York City isn't dictating where these projects are being essentially proposed. Because again, they're just kind of throwing out mass mailers, seeing what property owners come back. And if they can pay the property owner an extra $1,000 an acre than I can, well, they're going to get that lease. And if there is nothing in there that essentially states that that's probably not as beneficial or as wise to move through, well, then we get what we get in phase one.
Thank you for your presentation. We're at a good time for lunch. Are you thinking hour? Do we take an hour? Is that what people need, or do we want to get out earlier? All right, so we'll be back at 1 o'clock. Thank you.
What are you doing for lunch? Okay. Yeah. What about this? Oh. I've been a part. We're going.
Immediately start thinking, which is what is be very challenging. Pull down. Yeah, you know. Yeah. One area of it. Well, that was one of my. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how many were real. That's what I was thinking. So, I mean. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Big project. So, how's it? Yeah. There it is. Boom. You know, yeah, yeah, yeah. Did you